So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whichever it is for you. My name is Christopher Brown, and let's get started with this Cap 1 presentation. So first and foremost, we're going to start with carbohydrates, right? So glucose, and ultimately, barring gluconeogenesis or anything like that, the only way to get glucose into your body is by consuming carbohydrates, right? So we have tons of sources here. My personal favorite is probably the oatmeal and the pasta, but you could pick any of them. And then after consuming those carbohydrates, they're converted into glucose in the body, right? So no matter what kind of carbohydrate they are, converted into glucose. So then that glucose goes into glycolysis, serves three main purposes, right? So it produces two nicotinamide adenine dinucleotides. And then there's also hydrogen attached to those, but it comes in a non-hydrogen form. We'll get into that later. It produces 4 total ATP, but it costs 2 ATP to start. So the net gained ATP is 2 from this process, and then it produces pyruvate. That pyruvate then goes down into the link reaction. And then in the link reaction, it takes the pyruvate from the cytoplasm to the mitochondria. And then it produces 2 carbon dioxide, which is a waste product, produces 2 more NADH. I'm not going to pronounce that word anymore. And then it moves on to, it creates 2 acetyl-CoAs, right? So that acetyl-CoA goes into the Krebs cycle. Krebs cycle produces 2 more ATP, 4 moles of carbon dioxide, and then more NADH and FADH, which is new here. So it's flavin-adenine dinucleotide. And those also have hydrogens attached to it, but it has 2 of them. So then all of those electron carriers go down to the electron transport chain. We'll get more into that later when we get into fats. But it goes down an electron transport chain, and then what happens is it actually breaks off electrons from the NAD and the FADs, and those can go and be reused later. So that's what limits the availability. So those go back on later. And then that entire process is where most of the ATP is produced. So that's why that's the limiting factor. So because so much ATP is produced there, that's the, I wouldn't say most necessary step, but that's the most powerful step. And without that NAD and FAD, then it becomes slowed down or can actually even stop. Cool. So on to fat. So besides carbohydrates, another great source of ATP is fat. So ATP, I didn't address this in the last slide. ATP is adenosine triphosphate. So that's what I'm always referring to. So palmitate, which is what we're going to talk about here, is a very common fatty acid. It makes up about 20 to 30% of the fatty acids in the human body. So it's a pretty large amount considering how much fat we actually have on us. So this process, if you look, this graph actually has proteins, carbs, and fats on it. So fats are converted to fatty acids, which I'm going to address right here. So the limiting factor is hormone-sensitive lipase, which is what actually converts stored fats into fatty acids, which can be used to make acetyl-CoA through beta oxidation. So if you're unable to convert that fat to the usable form of fatty acid, then you can't get any more energy from fat. So that acetyl-CoA follows the same process as the acetyl-CoA from carbohydrates. It goes into the Krebs cycle, produces more NADH and FADH. Water is left off from there. And then it goes into the respiratory train oxidative phosphorylation. So that's like another term. It's actually like a section of the electron transport chain, or like another name for it. But yeah, so it goes in there, and then total from a 16 carbon chain of palmitate, a total of 129 ATP is produced net. So 2 ATP are used up during the process. So you're left with 129 ATP. So this is, vastly superior in terms of just raw ATP output than carbohydrates is. But there's a reason why you can't just use fat and never use carbohydrates. So we'll get into that in the next slide. Cool. So in order to compare which substrate or which macromolecule would be best at what time, we have to start to look at why we would use them at specific intensities. So the biggest thing you can see by this graph that as your intensity increases, it looks like right about that 36, 37% point or so, carbohydrates overtake fats, right? You start to utilize more carbohydrates. So why? We start to utilize more carbohydrates because the process is significantly faster to continually create ATP from fat. Now, obviously, fat produces, it was like 4 times as much ATP almost. But if you can't produce that ATP quickly, then you can't sustain high intensity exercise. And that's one of the things that, like, God is amazing in the sense that he created us. Our bodies know to do this no matter what. Like, as soon as you start exercising, your body says, okay, I'm at 70% VO2 max. I have to use carbohydrates. I can't replace this ATP using fat anymore. So that's pretty cool. So there's, on my next slide, I have an analogy for this, which is pretty nice. Cool. So the picture that I chose was kind of cool. Was one of Aesop's famous fables is the story of the hare and the tortoise racing, right? So the story goes, just for anyone that's not familiar, that tortoise and hare decide to have a race. The hare obviously dashes at the beginning. He's ridiculously far ahead of the turtle. He looks back. He says, oh, I can relax for a bit. He takes a nap. By the time he wakes up, the tortoise has crossed the finish line, or in some iterations of the story, the tortoise is just about to cross the finish line and the hare can't catch up. Tortoise wins, right? So slow and steady wins the race, right? So I brought here that fat is for longevity. So the fat is the tortoise, right? If the hare had just sprinted all the way to the finish, maybe he was tired, right? So maybe he couldn't have sprinted all the way to the finish. But if he would have sprinted all the way to the finish, tortoise had no chance of competing with him, right? Fat has no way of competing with glucose in terms of speed for ATP production. But over the long term, we saw that one molecule of fatty acid broken down produces significantly more ATP than glucose does. So if we have a choice, when our body has a choice, I should say, when we have a choice, when you're relaxing, when you're doing super low intensity exercise, so most of your RDAs, your regular daily activities, so you're cooking or you're showering or anything like that, anything that you're doing that's very easy to do, your body's going to utilize fat because it produces significantly more ATP. It's easier to do. But when it's time to go, right, you're sprinting out of your house because you woke up late, you're in the middle of a weight training session, whatever it is, your body utilizes mostly glucose because that produces more ATP quickly, or it produces ATP more quickly. So I thought the tortoise and the hare was a pretty good example. Because if you look at it over the long term, of course, fat is better, right? If you look at it in terms of raw ATP produced per molecule used, fat wins by a long shot, right? Fat at 9 calories per gram, carbohydrates at 4. It's easier to eat fat if you just need energy. But that energy isn't going to allow you, barring other processes in the body, like I said at the beginning, that we're not going to get into, fat is significantly slower, and therefore glucose is going to be a lot better anytime that you need to do something quickly. Cool. So that about wraps it up. There are my references for you. But yeah, that's it. Have a great day.